It's a clap. Come on. Go ahead. Good afternoon, everybody. A very warm welcome to the Evening Standard Stories Festival in association with Netflix. Wonderful to have you here, in particular for this conversation in which we're going to be talking about what makes a psychopath. My name's Julia Wheeler. It's my huge pleasure to welcome two authors whose books go some way towards answering those questions, as well as a lot more. Kerry Daynes is a consultant forensic psychologist who helps the police and government take vital decisions about high-risk criminals. She's spent a career working in prisons, high-security units and hospitals and giving evidence in court. Kerry is one of the experts on TV's Faking It, Tears of a Crime. Her book, What Lies Buried, uncovered stories of madness, badness and the misunderstood. Welcome, Kerry.
Thank you.
Mark Freestone is a leading psychology consultant who has worked in high-security prisons, housing some of the UK's most notorious and high-risk criminals. Coming to the field as a sociologist, he's now a reader in mental health at Queen Mary, University of London. He works with NHS England advising on real life and was a consultant on the programme Killing Eve, helping to build a realistic fictional life for many people's favourite psychopath, Villanelle. His book is Making a Psychopath. Please welcome Kerry and Mark.
Hello.
Let's begin, if we may, with some definitions, Mark. Talk us through psychopath, sociopath, where personality disorders fit in, and this is a big question, the sanity-insanity spectrum, some parameters, if you like.
It's a simple one to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Julia. So I suppose a psychopath for me, just to sort of really simplify it as much as I can, is somebody who has an impaired ability to understand their own emotions, to understand and process emotions in other people, and also has the ability to mask that inability through, I guess, a sort of superficial kind of charm. That means that if you meet a psychopath for a short space of time, you probably wouldn't know they were a psychopath, and they might even seem quite agreeable to you. There's lots of other aspects of psychopathy as we, I suppose, understand it, measure it and research it these days, but I think apart from those few features, they're all actually quite controversial. So one big idea is the concept that a psychopath necessarily has to be a criminal, which isn't necessarily true at all. It's quite possible to be a psychopath in the sense of reaching the threshold on something like the psychopath test, the psychopathy checklist, without actually having committed a crime. But it is quite difficult to do that. So I think there's a natural orientation to seeing a psychopath as somebody who is a criminal, but not necessary. A sociopath, on the other hand, that's kind of a term we don't really use anymore clinically or in the research literature, but it used to be a way of referring to people who, I guess, a psychopath we might think of, even still today, as somebody who was born that way, that they are that way because they inherited a psychopath gene, which isn't true, but maybe that's the popular perception. Whereas a sociopath was somebody whose disorder, whose, I suppose, their difficulties in being part of society, breaking the law, being aggressive, telling lies, was more because of the kind of environment that they grew up in. And I think today, those two terms have really sort of merged into our modern understanding of psychopathy. Sociopaths are part of the construct, and so are the more sort of, I guess, hereditary psychopaths. But the problem is that both of those two ideas are kind of simplifications of I guess, what we know psychopathy to be from the research, which is actually much more complex and diffuse and can capture a lot of different types of personality that we maybe wouldn't necessarily think of when we think of an archetypal psychopath, such as, I don't know, let's say Hannibal Lecter or even Villanelle from Killing Eve. So it simplifies a whole bunch of really interesting ideas about personality. And I guess that suggests, for me, psychopathy is a personality disorder, and I have to use scare quotes for that now, because I think increasingly telling somebody they have a disordered personality is quite unacceptably stigmatizing, and it's so I guess it's such a hopeless idea. It's, you are flawed as a person, isn't it?
I can see you squirming, Kerry. Go on.
Is it a disorder, though, really? Let me tell you, I know a guy who has very callous, unemotional traits. Yeah, not very much in touch with his own emotions, and certainly not very much in touch with other people's emotions. And also, he's probably one of the people I know who has killed the most other people. And his speciality move is to actually slit people's throats. He's also shot a 4-year-old. So you would think that that's a psychopath, wouldn't you? But actually, he works in the SAS. And the 4-year-old was strapped to a bunch of explosives, and he had to make a very quick decision as to whether he would kill that child for the sake of everybody else around him. So he is not known as a psychopath because he's not committing criminal behaviours, or, you know, he's killing people, but it's state-sanctioned murder, if you like. So actually he's hailed as a hero. So at what point does it become a disorder? I really dislike the word disorder.
What would you use instead?
It depends. I would say in terms of personality, then it's a personality style or it's a personality adaptation, because our personalities develop, don't they? Then they're not something, contrary to popular belief, that we are born with. They develop over time in accordance to the experiences that we have. So when I'm talking about mental disorder, I tend to use the word mental distress. I don't think that's not really appropriate, is it, for personality? But personality adaptation or personality development. But at what point, because it's a spectrum, isn't it, really, psychopathic behaviour, at what point does it become a disorder? Is it when you have broken the law? Is it when you have been caught for breaking the law? When do we actually call people psychopaths?
And that definition has changed over time, hasn't it? It's actually quite a recent thing in which psychopathy has become criminalised, if you like.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think that, I don't want to point the finger, but I think it's the work of Robert Hare, who's a Canadian psychologist, and he worked in prisons, high secure prisons in Canada in the 1970s and 80s. And the narrative goes in his own books that he became quite frustrated with people pulling the wool over his eyes, telling quite flagrant lies about their behaviour, deceiving him in relation to what they were thinking at the time, and not engaging properly with him as a psychologist. So he decided that he would create a checklist to, I guess, measure the different traits that he thought were attributable to psychopaths. And he based this actually on the work of another American psychiatrist called Herb Cleckley, who wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity in 1941, which I think the idea of the mask of sanity is what I was referring to right at the beginning, where a psychopath doesn't necessarily seem obviously to be a psychopath initially. They can hide that kind of lack of a moral or an emotional compass quite effectively with a sort of glib, superficial patter, a kind of charm that over a few minutes is pretty hard to get through. So Bob Hare created this checklist. He then refined it in, I think, 1988 to what we call the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which is now, and I have another co-author of ours, Emmy Thomas, who wrote Confessions of a Sociopath, told me I must not call it this, but I guess it is kind of the gold standard for assessing psychopathy, because simply every correctional service, the prison service in the UK, correction service in the USA, relies wholly on this checklist to make a judgment about whether or not somebody is a psychopath. Now, I don't know how far Kerry and I want to get into this, but I don't think it's a pretty good assessment of that at all, partly because, as Julia says, that it has this sort of criminal element baked into it.
Yeah, for those of you that aren't familiar with the psychopathy checklist, basically it's a 20-item checklist of characteristics of this, as you say, often called Cleckley psychopath or Robert Hare psychopath. And you have to score somewhere between 0 and 40. And if you score over 30, well, that's it. You're a card-carrying psychopath. Although for a lot of research, because they don't get people who score over 30, they actually bring down the threshold, and it's anybody that scores over 25. Now, I don't know whether you've ever measured yourself on the psychopathy checklist.
Oh, I
or
hope
what's
so.
your score?
I get 3.
You get 3.
Oh.
I get 4.
4.
I get 4, yeah. All right, so you're Mary Poppins in the room, not me. But the reason why most of us aren't going to score very highly is that you get points for things like criminal versatility, so having committed lots of different types of offences, for juvenile delinquency before the ages of 16, 12, for non-conformity with, restrictions placed upon you, whatever those restrictions might be. So, for example, you might have broken parole or not turned up for a court case, that kind of thing. So a lot of these items are criminal behaviour, and it becomes very, very circular. Somebody is a psychopath because they've done bad things. And then we say, well, the reason why they've done bad things is because they are a psychopath. So it's not a great measure of psychopathy as far as I'm concerned, but it's the one that I have to use because, as you say, it's the one that is recognised in all of our correctional facilities. It's the one that is recognised by courts.
And I think, in the United States, it actually can mediate the death penalty, can't it? So if you're a psychopath in some states, it'll save you from the chair, and in others, you can be put to death if you're a psychopath.
I think that psychopathy has become an explanation for terrible behaviours, and actually, it really doesn't explain anything, does it? It describes a certain set of behaviours and personality characteristics, the PCLR. It doesn't explain jack, really, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that it has become a get out for some. Oh, well, I'm sorry I did that. It's just that I'm a psychopath, so I couldn't help myself. It's like that fable, isn't it? The scorpion and the frog. The scorpion wants to get to the other side of the river, and a frog says, "Climb on my back." And as they're going over the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And the frog says, "Oh, but now we're both going to drown. Why did you do that?" "Oh, well, it's just my nature. Couldn't help myself." I hear that so often. But equally, I think for others, it's become a label where they feel that they are condemned. And yes, in America, it can actually lead to the death penalty because these people are seen as beyond redemption.
And that narrative is problematic as well, because as well as, I'm a psychopath, therefore I do this, it's I'm a psychopath, therefore I can't be changed. So it not only, I think, from our clients occasionally, but also, I guess, from the systems, it just encourages this kind of nihilism. If someone's a psychopath, you can't change them. What are you going to do with them? Oh, I don't know, we'll stick them in prison and just let them stay there until they die, effectively, or maybe their sentence expires if they have that. And we were talking earlier about the Dutch system. Now, the Dutch have a system called long stay, where if somebody doesn't want to engage with treatment, they can actually stay in a hospital or a prison for the rest of their natural lives. But I think what maybe makes the Dutch a little bit different is that they never stop trying to re-engage people to try and change their perspective, change their lives, think about their offending behaviour, come back into a road towards rehabilitation. Whereas we've tried this in the UK with the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder Programme, which is now pretty much a dirty word to everyone in forensic psychology. But I think we gave up quite soon on that. We didn't.
Let's talk about that. Just tell us what it was, what it did, and how the results were kind of the opposite to what was hoped.
Well, it always is it Francis Ford Coppola about Apocalypse Now, where he says there were too many of us, we had too many ideas, too much money, too many equipment, too many drugs, and little by little we went insane. And that was kind of what happened. The UK government, on the basis of the fact that we were not very good at treating psychopaths or people with a diagnosis of personality disorder, put a huge amount of money into this programme to try and find a way to treat people
who had... Was it £63 million?
That was the initial investment, and then that's 25 million a year after that.
Wow.
It worked out, the total bill by the time it was wound down in 2011 was about 180 million.
Of your money.
Yes, yeah, and ours.
And ours, yeah.
And I think there was a piece of research done shortly before the programme was closed that showed it had made negligible difference, not just in terms of people's reoffending, but also in terms of their risk of reoffending, that we hadn't successfully reduced the risk people with a diagnosis of psychopathy or personality disorder from reoffending at all, which it isn't really hard to do, actually. If you just change someone's motivation, you can make some significant gains in their likelihood of not reoffending. But we hadn't even managed to do that, despite this huge investment. There were 3 new hospital units built, and the Fens unit, which was a repurposed hospital prison wing. And it was all a terrible failure because it sounds, there's something very British about this. We couldn't agree on the model that we were going to use. We had the cognitive behavioural therapists demanding cognitive behavioural therapy, the dialectical behaviour therapists demanding dialectical behaviour therapy, the psychiatrists demanding more medication, whatever it was they did in the Fens unit, which I guess is sort of psychoanalytically informed cognitive work. And there would always be arguments about which the best model was and which we should all do. Whereas in the Netherlands, for example, there's a great deal of alignment about how you approach treating people with a diagnosis of personality disorder. But we never quite got to the heart of, this isn't really about treatment. It's not about which is the best treatment. It's about what's the best way of managing people and helping people to manage themselves, giving them the skills they need to go back into the community, finding a pathway that lets them, for example, pick up a skill while they're in hospital or in prison, learn a new trade, do education. And that wasn't, I think, enough of a core part of
And there was
the
never
SPD.
really anything to address trauma, was there?
It's ironic, towards the very end, the penny
very end,
dropped, but
right.
too late, I think.
So if you make it that far, if you don't drop out at that point, then we're going to address your trauma, which is probably what part of the hardest.
So,
No.
Kerry, for you, what should that money have been spent on? What would have made the difference?
For me, I think we should spend more money on prevention, because we very much in this country like to close the door after the horse has bolted, don't we? So prevention, I think, is where we should be spending our money primarily. But I would like to see more trauma-informed services. I would like to see, as you say, skill building, education, and money put into where are these people going to go? What environments are they going to go to after they leave prison? Because actually just dropping them back into the same environment that they've come from isn't going to be helpful at all, is it? And I think what a lot of, and I'm not just talking about offenders who have been diagnosed with psychopathy here, but a lot of prison inmates do is they learn to say the right thing. In fact, I know a guy on C Wing at Wakefield Prison who will teach you for a small fee exactly what to say to get through your parole board review. That's common in prisons. So they learn to say the right thing, and even their attitudes and beliefs might even shift during cognitive behavioural therapy. But then, as soon as they are back in the environment that they came from with other people who share their attitudes and beliefs, their pro-offending attitudes and beliefs, they shift back again really quite quickly. So I think that, we're just barking up the wrong tree. And I think that we have to hold our hands up and say, we're getting it really, really wrong here. And other countries are getting it very, very right. So why don't we learn from them? And I think that's another very British thing, isn't it? That we don't want to actually concede that maybe other people have got the answers. I should say that there is still an overhang from DSPD, which is the dangerous and severe personality disorders treatment. The personality disorders pathway in prisons has been evaluated, and it's been found, the same as sex offender treatment program has been found, to have a small but nevertheless significant increase in offending behaviour in those that have gone through it. So actually what we're doing is we are making people worse, and we are creating victims, and that to me is just not acceptable.
And we only know that because somebody leaked a government report.
Yeah, we know that because the results of the study have been leaked, but so far the Ministry of Justice is not releasing that report and is sitting on those results, and is in fact continuing to spend money on these programs that they know make people with personality disorder diagnoses more likely to reoffend, and that's exactly what they did with sex offenders.
So Kerry mentioned prevention. Let's take it back one stage and talk about the causes, if we can, Mark, of psychopathy
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question.
and in relation to prevention?
Yes. Okay. So the research is contradictory for reasons that we might come to a bit later. But essentially, there is some agreement with the old hypothesis that you can be, I guess, at least in part, born with some of the psychopathic tendencies, or they develop at a very, very early age. So, some research conducted by Essie Viding at UCL showed that what we call callous unemotional traits. So this is the sort of part of psychopathy which essentially corresponds to a not caring attitude about other people, a tendency to use other people not to try and work out who they are or trying to form positive relationships with them, but simply to get what you want. And then if those people suffer as a result of you using them, for example, if you're a bully or if you ask them for some kind of sexual contact that they're not comfortable with, that's sort of fair game in the minds of somebody with these traits. Those traits can manifest quite early, sort of the age of 7 or 9 in young children, and not all of the children with those traits will go on to become psychopaths by any means, but we do know that the traits are quite heritable. We know that when you have a pair of separated twins, they will both still, if they're separated very early on, they will still have both share those callous unemotional traits. But as I said, this isn't entirely psychopathy, and then the question is, well, who is it with those traits who then becomes a psychopath or reaches the threshold
And
for
who
the
becomes
stamp?
Prime Minister?
And who goes on to other activities, yeah, or who makes it a good go of it. I still love that Jim Fallon, the Stanford
study, yeah.
professor, yeah, but one of his studies was doing contrast tomography, CT scans of people's brains, and he was looking for particular evidence of psychopathy in the brain, specifically around the amygdala, which is a region in the center of the brain, just above the limbic system, that we think governs people's ability to perceive emotion. So logically, it should be part of the construct of psychopathy. And he scanned a bunch of people, and he was a bit short on controls, so he scanned himself as part of it, just to kind of make up the numbers. And he was reviewing some slides, and he saw this brain, which, I mean, it's quite startling. We don't have the slide, but this person's amygdala showed virtually no activation in response to quite a serious emotional stimuli, and he thought, wow, this person is a complete psychopath. So he looked, he was like, I probably better notify someone. So he looks through the records of his research study, and it's his own scan. He has the neurological features of a psychopath, but he's a successful professor. And there's a lovely little documentary that was done about this, where he's hanging out with his children, and he says, well, sometimes I think that maybe this might have some truth to it, because whenever people come to my house, I just think, would you just eat your food and get out? Why are you here? What are you wasting my time for? And his kids are like, yeah, Dad can be a bit tetchy sometimes. So there may be something to it, but certainly it's not the case that everyone who has a diagnosis of psychopathy is, a criminal or poses a threat to other people in society.
In fact, people who are high on psychopathic traits are more likely to do brave things, aren't they? They're more likely to engage in heroic behaviour because of lack of fear.
Yeah. Well, this is really interesting, and that also means that when you get very, very high on the psychopathy checklist, none of our assessments of risk function anymore. Like if you have somebody with a psychopathy score of over 30, you could as easily roll a dice as perform a structured risk assessment and try and predict whether they're likely to be an offender or not. It's almost as if, as Kerry says, this is not really a predisposition to offending behaviour or necessarily even violence, so much as a sort of, I guess, just an absence of certain emotional connections, which suggests that this isn't somebody who needs to be punished, but somebody who maybe needs more help in establishing those connections and finding a way of, I guess, perceiving their own emotions and emotions in other people that lets them function better in society. But when I say function better, I mean Jim Fallon does all right. He's got 3 kids and a professorship.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you think about it, there's some research that's been done at the University of Oxford, and I think it's a bit, it's dodgy. I'm going to say it's dodgy research, but I'm going to mention it anyway.
Anybody in from Oxford?
It's not the best designed research by quite a long stretch. However, they've suggested that the top professions of people who have psychopathic traits are things like surgeon, because I suppose if you're going to stick a knife into somebody, it helps, doesn't it? If you're not going to be overly anxious about that, or you're not overly squeamish, and you're not thinking about that person as necessarily a person, but a set of, whatever part of their anatomy you're looking at, just seeing it as that, a part of somebody's anatomy. And also the clergy, which is interesting. I don't quite understand that one. Police, people who are in counselling and psychology jobs, though, luckily, are least likely to have psychopathic traits. People who work in media, very likely to have psychopathic traits. I work in both, so I guess I'm just somewhere in the middle there.
There were academics on that.
Where were academics? I don't think that he didn't look at academics. I don't know why.
Oh, good. We're still flying under the radar then.
Yeah, maybe didn't want to reveal too much about himself. I don't know.
So given all that, Mark, talk to us about environment and the effect that can have if people do have a genetic or the sort of the nature side of psychopathy.
Yeah, that's another good question. So I've talked about some research that suggests there's a heritable element to psychopathy, but we also, aside from the question of the people who inherit psychopathic traits then developing into full card-carrying psychopaths, as Kerry put it, there's the question of, I think, people who experience a high level of neglect or abuse, when you perform neurological scans on them, will show damage or lesions or structural problems with the same areas of the brain as correlate with psychopaths as well. Again, so the amygdala, which is as I said, the part of the brain that processes emotional responses, and also risk-reward, which is maybe something we could talk about later if we have time. But also the connection between the amygdala and the orbital prefrontal cortex, which essentially helps people process social signals. So you have this sort of defectiveness that's not necessarily due to any kind of hereditary mechanism or genetic mechanism. It's entirely due to having an environment that essentially has forced your brain to switch off the really important emotional pathways. And if you think of this sort of developmentally, if you have a child who is neglected, they cry, they express a need for care, for food, for love, for affection, for contact, they don't get that. You can't flourish as a human being if you're continually making requests for essential things that are constantly denied. You have to adapt to that hostile environment effectively. And we think that one of the ways that children adapt to this is simply not to grow those neurological pathways that allow us to perceive emotion in others, because they're just going to be damaging, particularly if you have a caregiver who's aggressive or threatening. Not being able to understand that that behaviour is aggressive or threatening is actually helpful, because it allows you to thrive where you wouldn't have been able to if you were constantly feeling anxious about the threat that was posed to you. And thinking a bit about what we were saying about prevention, there's certainly a sort of threshold around the ages of 13 to 16 where if you intervene, if you offer people a more nurturing, supportive environment, if you take them out of maybe the negative environment, whatever it may be, care or even their own families, and give them a supportive environment where they have space to move, to talk, to interact with other children, those pathways can regrow very rapidly. We're talking over the course of a number of months. The issue that we have is when you get to most of the men that we would have worked with in dangerous and severe personality disorder units, or even most prisons, they're in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, and by then the brain's much more established. It's much harder to think about changing those kind of pathways unless somebody somehow has the motivation to do it.
Let's talk, Kerry, about the male-female split.
Right, well, I don't know that it will come as much of a surprise to anybody to discover that psychopaths are more likely than not to be men. I don't know the exact figures. I think that they've changed. Is it a case that 3% of the population will be?
There's been research saying it's that.
And what's the split between male and female?
It's about a 50th of the population of. So what's that? 1 in 401. So if we say 1 in 35. That probably sounds a bit high. 1 in 35 men would be a psychopath. Then 1 in.
That sounds worryingly high.
450 women would be a psychopath. It's very much lower.
Right, and that might be, of course, to do with the way that females are socialised, because we are encouraged to be more caring, aren't we? And we're encouraged to involve ourselves in group activities activities, reciprocal things and caring, nurturing things, whereas boys are maybe directed more towards mechanical things, because that's what we assume that boys want to do, and we assume that girls want to have tea parties with their friends, which of course is absolute nonsense, and that impacts the brain. And I think also I don't. Do you think it's a sexist diagnosis?
Well, crime is very sexist.
Yeah.
It's for a number of reasons, but I think you're just more likely to be a criminal if you're a man, because you're perceived as somebody.
And you're more likely to be a violent criminal, aren't you, if you're a man? And I think that psychopathy is associated with violence, isn't it, in people's minds? Whereas actually, I suppose women can be just as damaging, but they do it in a more manipulative way by really kind of playing on the emotions and the relationships that they have with people. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, when the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder program was set up, there were 2,000 beds for men and 40 for women, of which only 15 ever got filled. And I sure, the women in there were probably in the right place. But it goes to show that we couldn't even find 40 women in the whole of the prison estate to fill those beds. But I think again, it's sort of, crime is very sexist because women aren't seen by most of the sort of criminal establishments as being good criminals. I think that might be changing with the things around the gangs in London and county lines now, that women are getting involved at similar rates to young men. But I think certainly the men that I've worked with in prisons are very, very misogynistic, and they just don't like the idea of women being part of their inner circle at all. And if we then think that psychopathy as a construct is heavily correlated with criminal behaviour, regardless of your emotional and cognitive makeup, then it makes sense that men would be diagnosed more. So I think it is kind of sexist to the extent that that's a good thing.
And cultural factors, I think, do play a role in the development of psychopathy. My absolute most favourite study of all times. Have we got any Scottish people here? No. They looked at, they compared Scottish psychopaths with English psychopaths and also American psychopaths. And they found that Scottish psychopaths scored less highly on the psychopathy checklist, and they couldn't quite work this out. But when they looked at it, it was because they weren't scoring points for one particular aspect of psychopathy, which you've mentioned, which is superficial charm. So basically, the Scottish psychopaths didn't have any charm, whereas the American psychopaths would screw you over and then tell you to have a nice day. The Scottish psychopaths would screw you over and then tell you to screw yourself, quite frankly. So this is how cultural factors can play a role.
Yeah.
We've talked about crime being sexist, but let's talk about defences being gendered, and by that, Kerry, I mean the red mist defence. Tell us about that.
The red mist defence. Well, my book is not about psychopaths. There's one story about psychopaths, but it's about the whole range of people that I see, and it's about, I think, really, it's about busting the myth that people who are diagnosed with mental health disorders are going to be dangerous, because I think that that's a big stigma that that faces people with mental health problems. But one of the stories is about Stuart and his new girlfriend, and Stuart was fresh out of prison, having served just, I think, 3.5 years for the manslaughter of his first partner. And he, like many men, had used the defence, or rather the partial defence to murder, which is loss of control. So basically, his defence was that he was thrown into a temporary state of madness, if you like. He totally lost control, and he found himself hitting his first wife over the head with a shovel that just happened to be, handy, because she revealed that she was going to leave him. And if you read the story, actually there was a lot of evidence that this was not a spontaneous combustion at all. In fact, it was premeditated and it was planned. And the story is not necessarily about that offence, but about the relationship that he's having with a new girlfriend. So I don't want to give too much away. But the defence of loss of control used to be called provocation. And it was written into the law, many years ago. And the idea was that you had a defence available to you if you suddenly had a hot-blooded moment because something provoked you. And what was written into the law at that time was that what might provoke a reasonable man might be discovering that his wife has been unfaithful, or discovering somebody in the act of sodomy with their son. So you can see that this was a law that was written for men. And actually, even though it's been through various different, manifestations over the years, it still is a defence that works for men, because you've got to have your strength. You've got to have the strength that is immediately available to most men and not women in order to lose control, haven't you? Because I've never heard of, nobody's ever said to me, oh, well, I ended up getting beaten black and blue because I lost control, and started to beat up somebody who was far more bigger and more powerful than me. So I think that there's always an element of choice. And I looked at the latest research into domestic homicide, which actually shows from a review of, I think it was something around 390 plus domestic homicide reviews, that actually the typical pattern is not that there is a loss of control, not that a red mist descends, but actually these are planned and premeditated homicides. And yet, again and again and again, men are saying, no, I lost control. And the kind of reasons that they give for losing control that have worked in court are things like, well, she moved the mustard pot and she knows that really irritates me. That resulted in a man being convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. And also, they call it the nagging and shagging defence. Well, my wife was criticising my manhood, and therefore that caused me to lose my temper and kill her. And then the judge says, oh, right, well, I understand that. That would provoke any reasonable man, wouldn't it? Therefore, I'm going to give you a sentence of 3 years, 5 years, etc., etc. So it's a very gendered behaviour and a gendered defence.
It's victim blaming, isn't it?
Of course it's victim blaming, because really provocation is they were asking for it. That's what it means, isn't it, really?
Mm. And Mark, you've done some research in this area, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, not in my book, but again, one of the patients I worked with for actually a long time. He went from high secure hospital down to medium secure. He was arrested and charged with aggravated bodily harm for beating his girlfriend up because he suspected, with no reasonable basis, that she was having an affair. In court, the charges were downgraded to assault because of the diminished responsibility due to provocation defence, and he walked free. Well, he didn't walk free. He got a suspended sentence because assault is a relatively minor crime. Had he got the conviction for ABH, he would have gone to prison. And then I think 6 years later, he's in another relationship, and there's a huge argument around fidelity again. This time, he picks up a saucepan, beats his partner over the head with it, knocks her unconscious, and places her in a vat of acid to dissolve her body. And the difficult part of this, sorry for those of you who are of a sensitive nature, but she actually survives. She wakes up in extreme pain, runs to the phone, calls the police and says, my partner's trying to kill me, I need help. The police come, and she's sent to hospital, where she recovers to an extent, like she's alive, but he was charged then at that point with attempted murder and sent to prison and then eventually to hospital. So the defence in that case, this provocation defence, effectively prevented us from identifying somebody who was at very extreme risk of violence towards their partner. And in that sort of context, what's interesting to me is what is the trigger for somebody to exert that kind of violence over somebody else? What is it that causes somebody to decide to use effectively lethal force against someone else? And when I first started the research, I was like, well, red mist, everybody knows about that, provocation, that's got to be in there. Unreasonable anger or anger due to provocation has to be in there. And for this research project, we looked through both the court depositions and the offenders' accounts of over 600 serious offences perpetrated by men and women in the UK prison estate. And we thought we'd found 80 cases of this sort of red mist, inappropriate anger trigger for violence. But when we looked at each of them, there was always what I would call a narcissistic wound. I hope that's not too psychodynamic, but that is essentially somebody said something to them, which caused them to react so violently that they then attack that other person with varying degrees of force. And it makes me think, I think in the end, so only 2 of the offences of the 600, could we actually see no other explanation than simply the red mist? In all of the other cases, it was clearly a very disproportionate response to a trivial act by somebody else, like somebody saying, "Oh, you're not looking so good today," or you're a cuck. And that so the male ego couldn't stand it.
I'm thinking, who has a vat of acid? Where does that come from? Is that not evidence?
But it's too late. It's too late, Kerry. He should have gone away.
That blows my mind. But I think the feminist perspective is that actually loss of control is a taking of control. So it's when there's this ego wound, where somebody is being left, or somebody has had their sexual prowess called into question. These type of things. So it's, I feel I'm losing control of this person and I want to gain control. And actually, you'll usually find in their history that they've got a history of coercive control. So manipulation that's not necessarily physical violence, but certainly manipulating somebody and using all kinds of surreptitious methods to get somebody, a woman, to do what they want. And when that is no longer working, what else do they have but violence? So it's a taking of control.
Are you okay to talk about the mobile phone in the kitchen in your book?
I don't want to give too much away, but
I don't want you to, but it's such a cool idea.
There were a lot of red flags about Stuart, and I found myself kind of shouting into the breeze, really, because I was saying I'm really concerned about this chap, and more so I'm concerned about the relationship that he's having with his new girlfriend. And everyone was saying,
this is kind of like at a halfway house.
Yes,
isn't it,
he's out of prison now. He's out of prison now, and he's kind of making his way back into the community, and he's established a new relationship. And everyone was saying, oh no, he's a really nice guy. It's just that the red mist descended upon him, and actually lovely. He's a model patient. I mean, how often have we heard that? Model resident. And I actually went to talk to his new partner because of something that we'd found in the grounds, and I won't say what that was. And she showed us something in the kitchen, and it was actually a mobile phone that he had glued onto her wall. So he knew that whenever she was texting him from it, that she was at home, and he was demanding that she basically checked in with him all the time using this mobile phone. So classic coercive control.
But it's not only new partners or people on the street who are manipulated. I mean, you've had a situation in prison where actually you had to think hard about a relationship, and also as did a prison officer with the same person. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I mean, this was very early on when I first started working in a maximum security Category A prison in the north, and I was there doing a research project looking at how prisons functioned, like how they accommodated particularly people with diagnoses at that time of psychopathy or severe personality disorder, and therefore I was on a wing full of people with that diagnosis, if you want to see it in those terms. And one of them, seemed a little bit more genuine than the others. He was quite outwardly quite pleasant to people. He clearly liked intimidating people in certain social situations, but at the same time, when we had the guitar club, which I was part of, where we just used to sit around and do Eagles covers and Hotel Zorba by the White Stripes. I don't know why that's important information, but for some reason it always sits with me. He was very nice. I'm going to say very charming because he was, which would already clue you into where this is going. But I always thought, well, he'll do all right here. He's sort of, he's got the ability to engage with the prisoners. The prison officers seem to mostly like him. At the same time, there were some red flags around him. He set me up to fail by telling me to go to 2 different points of the prison at the same time without me realising that they were actually 2 different points, and then called me out about it in a staff prisoner meeting. But once is kind of fair game. It's just a jape or something, I guess, isn't it? So I let it lie. And then later on, he'd asked me to get him some guitar sheet music to bring into the prison for him. Now, if you're in a maximum security prison, there are very, very strict limits on what can come in and out. Pretty much nothing is permitted in and out. So I went away and sort of thought about it for a bit. And then I brought the sheet music, I printed out and brought it in with me to the next day in prison. But for some reason, I couldn't quite bring myself to bring it through the gate, so it stayed on the seat of my car, and I didn't see Paul that day, so I didn't get the chance to hand it over to him anyway. Then I had to go, I think I was on a placement in Broadmoor, so I went down from the prison and didn't come back for a couple of weeks. And when I came back, everything had sort of changed. Like, the atmosphere in the prison was very, very different. Nobody was talking to each other. There was this sort of really anxious, tense feeling about the place, and there was no sign of Paul. And what had happened was that it turns out that one of the prison officers, a female prison officer, had been having a sexual affair with Paul, and as part of that affair, he'd been getting her to bring things into the prison for him, including pornography, compact discs. Compact discs are problematic in a prison because you can use them for all sorts of things. More sheet music as well, which made me think of myself. And this affair had only been discovered because the prison officer had become involved in a dispute with some other prison officers who were having, I think, something silly like a food fight in the staff canteen. And she tried to sort of say, look, you can't do that in here, lads. And one said, well, at least we're not boffing the prisoners. And that was, so clearly there was some awareness that this was going on, but it wasn't being discussed. And it was only at that point when one of the senior officers heard it that there was, everything came to light. The prison officer lost her job, and of course, because this man had a history of psychiatric imprisonment, I think she was actually investigated for sexual relations with a vulnerable adult. So even though she'd clearly been manipulated into this relationship, she was nevertheless herself likely to be tried for a criminal act, which is a little bit perverse to say the least. So I had a very narrow escape because, just like the prison officer, I was sort of falling into this guy's charms and very, very nearly brought something in that would have potentially cost me my job and certainly my placement there. So it's hard. I think unless you've done this work for quite a while, it's easier than you might think to be manipulated because it starts with the little things and then builds up and builds up and builds up.
We've got microphones if you've got questions. There's a microphone either side. If you pop your hand up and then just wait for the microphone to come to you. It can be about anything that we've talked about so far, or it can be about something completely different. There's a question. We'll come here to this lady first, please. Keep your hand up with the mask. That's it. In the second row. Thank you. And we'll hold on to the mics, but if you could just keep it near, because then we're all COVID secure and whatever.
What were both of your inspirations to go into this field? Because I imagine it's like quite an emotionally taxing one at times.
So what was your motivation, Kerry, to go into it?
My motivation, without wanting to sound like a Miss World contestant, I want a world full of peace, etc., etc., but I did actually want to contribute to a world with less victims in it. And so that's why I was so devastated to discover that actually a lot of the programs that I was part and parcel of that were being delivered in the prison service and also in secure hospitals turned out to do the opposite of that. I mean, there's nothing more devastating really for a psychologist to find out that you are doing the opposite of what you set out to do. So that was my motivation. My initial reason for getting into forensic psychology was entirely by accident, really, because I wanted to go into marketing. So I decided to do a psychology degree, and then because all of the best life-changing decisions are made, aren't they, in Freshers Week, when you're usually pie-eyed and, you know, you're full of raging hormones. There was a really good-looking boy in the law classes, so I decided to sign up for law subsidiaries, because his name was Stephen P. English, and I wanted to know what the P stood for, because to me it was possibility. And in actual fact, I never, ever got the courage to speak to him. I looked at him from the side of the lecture theatre, and then eventually a great love affair developed, but with the law. So I thought, well, how can I put law and psychology together? And I became a forensic psychologist.
Thank goodness for Stephen P. English.
Thank God, yes.
Tell us you've got a similar story, Mark.
No, that's very I needed a job. And the only job I could find was my PhD supervisor said, well, they built this maximum secure unit down the road, which was Rampton Hospital at the time, because I was based at University of Nottingham, and they need somebody to do an ethnographic study where basically you immerse yourself in it and try and work out what's going on. And the only job that I could get was a research funding to study the dangerous and severe personality disorder unit, and that was sort of what kicked off my career in, I guess, forensic mental health, which is now going on 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years, 2004, 17 years, yeah.
What keeps you in it? Is it the why? Is it the mystery?
I think it's just there's never a dull moment. There really is never a day when, for example, I worked in a secure unit in London until 2018, and I would never go in to work knowing how the day was going to pan out. There would always be something that would happen that would turn my expectations of somebody upside down. I don't necessarily mean the patient, and I don't necessarily mean for the worse or for the better. It could be anything, but you know, everything from staff members bringing members bringing weapons in to defend themselves, to there's another staff member who got locked out of the secure unit boundary and had to be let in by a patient. There was a patient who started a Tai Chi meditation group, another patient who used to make incredibly strong curries, and I signed up to do the cooking class with him and nobody told me about it. So I'm not adverse to chili by any means, but this was clearly an act of chili-based violence that I was then involved in. So it's just that it's never boring, and maybe it says something about me, but I think that really keeps me certainly coming to work and doing research and doing clinical work when I can as well.
Great. There was a question, you had a question, we'll just get a microphone to you. Pop your hand up in the front row, and then we'll come to you afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah, I was interested in what you were saying about typical careers that rank highly on the psychopath thing. You mentioned military and surgeons. I'm not being facetious here, but do politicians also rank in there somewhere? I would have thought they'd rank quite highly in that table.
And unfortunately, that study has never been done, but I think it would be absolutely fascinating, wouldn't it?
I think we need number 10 to definitely finance that, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, think about, callousness, lack of remorse, pathological lying, manipulativeness. Yeah, I mean, I think so, absolutely.
I think there's something about, I don't know if we used to call it hacking at university, where you get into the students' union and you just work your way through the pillars of, becoming representative and then spokesperson and maybe joining a political party, and you're just constantly networking. And there's just something very instrumental about that. You're using other people as a leg up in your career. And it kind of worries me that sort of defines our political class at the moment, because instrumental use of people, I'd say, really is a major part of psychopathy, almost like a defining part, because in order to do that, you kind of have to not care about the people that you're doing it to. Otherwise, you'd be too ashamed, I think, and walk away.
And when you look at actually how harmful policies can be, are they not the most dangerous of psychopaths? I would say that potentially, yes, they are. In fact, more than potentially, of course they are. Yeah. How many people have died because of cuts to benefits?
Which comes back to your prevention point, doesn't it, really? Yeah. There was a question, you've been very patient in the middle here, if we could get the microphone there. Keep your hand up. Yeah, great. Ooh,
hi.
sorry.
It's a question about the Bolger, the little boy that was...
Jamie Bolger.
Jamie Bolger. The two little lads that actually murdered him, will they be considered psychopaths? And also, you were talking about psychopaths may have a history of being having a deprived background or something? I mean, was that the case with these two lads that killed that boy?
I do know that the report on the Bolger case said that Venables had callous unemotional traits, which is a clear reference to the hereditary traits. What I don't know is much about their backgrounds. I'm awful with true
Their
crime.
backgrounds were absolutely dreadful, yeah. And one of them, I'm not sure which one, would stay out all night and climb in through a window, and his parents would never look for him, and that's because he was terrified of violence at home. He wouldn't necessarily be fed at home. So, and I think that he said that actually, as a result of what he had done to James, his life in services was actually far better than the life that he had at home, which I think tells you a great deal, doesn't it?
Is there any sense, do you have any information about, because obviously their identities were changed and so on, any information about their rehabilitation or otherwise that's sort of known within your fields?
Well, if I did, I don't think I'd be able to tell you. I think
yeah.
it's just a case of what we know, which has been made public, in that one of them, who was actually seen as the most vulnerable of the two, the less streetwise of the two, had more of he had a learning disability, is actually the most dysfunctional, and he is still in prison at the moment because he has repeatedly engaged in other problematic behaviours, including downloading child abuse imagery off the internet. And the one who was seen as possibly the ringleader, because he was more street savvy and had higher intellectual ability, but actually didn't have the same background of aggression that actually the other child had. He's gone on and lived an unproblematic life.
Interesting, thank you. There's a question just here, yeah.
About the checklist and the factors that involved in these situations, but what you haven't done is to talk about people that seem to have crossed a border which for most people we associate here, where they are totally remorseless killers and cruel punishers of people, where they don't seem to have any concept of humanity. And it'd be quite interesting to get your views. You talk about trying to get some people back from the position they are with a certain help, and you talked about the program that failed and the Dutch program that is doing well. Mm-hmm. But when you are dealing with people who are what most people would call totally evil and are prepared to kill or maim or do whatever they want without a single concern, surely there's no way back for those people, whatever treatment that you could offer them.
Okay, so where are we on people being evil or otherwise? Kerry?
Well, evil's just not a helpful word as far as I'm concerned, because to me it's almost like a religious concept. It's, what is evil? It suggests that somebody's less than human, and I think that when you start to look at people as less than human, it's a very dangerous thing, not least because you think that you're going to spot them because there's going to be something very obviously other about them. So evil for me it's just not a concept that I find helpful. Of course, not every person is going to be able to be rehabilitated. And some people who I've worked with who are serving whole life sentences, I think, yeah, absolutely, that's the right thing in terms of not just the, whether they are able to be rehabilitated or not, but because they have committed acts that are so much of an affront really to all of us, that they shouldn't be released back onto the streets. I've also worked with people who have got lesser sentences and have ended up back on the streets. And I've been concerned about that, but I've actually been able to manage them without problem in the community. So I try and just keep an open mind, really. And it's a case of, if somebody's on my caseload, I'm going to do everything in my damn power to make sure that they lead a productive life that is safe, and try not to, be overwhelmed with my own judgments of them.
I've got a minute. Yeah, I think, I don't know who you were thinking about with your question, which was an interesting one, but Ian Brady sprung to my mind as somebody who I think, after being caught for his crimes and sent to prison, he essentially used his own imprisonment simply to further his own goal of causing the maximum possible amount of distress possible to as many people. And a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists, far more established and probably better than me, we simply use to write reports where he would drip feed alleged pieces of information about missing children and bodies on the moors in order simply to further his degree of control. Now, faced with that, I have no kind of answers, unfortunately. I think where somebody is simply so determined to exert control over other people that they use their own imprisonment as a method to carry on their overall project, I don't see a way forward at all. But what I think I would say is that is a very small proportion of people, even who would attract the term psychopath. And I think James Blair, who's the president of the American Association for the Study of Psychopathy, said the problem is that we fail so many people with that diagnosis because we have no optimism. Essentially, the diagnosis itself, once you make it, defeats us, as actually happens to someone in Kerry's book as well. And that's not good enough. Just because somebody has that title doesn't mean that they are necessarily remorseless and beyond help. And I think that the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder program may have failed, but as we were saying, there's hope from the Dutch system as well, and also there's systems in Canada, Germany, where we've seen some really promising stuff coming back. So I would say maybe we should stop obsessing about this top group of primarily men, aren't they, who really we don't have anything to offer yet, and focus more on the people below that who attract these kind of difficult labels, but try and think about maybe going beyond that label and offering them something more.
And actually, all psychopaths are different, which is the point of your book, isn't it? They're not a heterogeneous group. They are, vastly different in so many different ways. Eskimos have 17 different words for snow. Maybe at some point we'll have 17 or more words for psychopaths, just to capture really the nuances and the differences between them.
And when we do, we'll have you back to talk about it. Thank you for leaving it on a very optimistic note. Thanks so much for coming. Brilliant questions. But most of all, thank you, Kerry and Mark. They'll be signing books downstairs. It's all in there and they're brilliant, these books. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.